were slaves, purchased as children from the steppes of Central Asia, from the slave markets of the Caucasus, from the Black Sea ports where human cargo was sold like livestock, torn from their families at ages when other children learned to read and play, transported across mountains and deserts to Egypt, and trained from childhood to be instruments of war. They had no homeland to call their own. They had no families waiting for their return. They had nothing but their training and their brothers in arms. They were called Mamluks, from the Arabic word meaning owned or property, and in September 1260s, these former slaves did something that no free army had accomplished in 50 years of continuous warfare across 3 continents. They destroyed a Mongol army in open battle. They broke the most terrifying war machine the world had ever seen. At Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, in the hills of Galilee, the unstoppable force met an immovable object, and the unstoppable force shattered. How? How did slaves defeat the conquerors of half the known world? How did men who were once property annihilate the legacy of Genghis Khan himself? How did the owned become masters of the masters? To understand this battle and its significance, you need to understand what the world looked like in September 1260. You need to grasp the scale of Mongol conquest and the depth of terror it had inspired. The Mongol Empire was and remains the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its peak, it stretched from the Pacific shores of Korea to the forests of Poland, from the frozen wastes of Siberia to the sweltering banks of the Persian Gulf. In a single generation, the Mongols had conquered more territory than Rome had accumulated in 400 years of relentless expansion. They had destroyed the Jin dynasty that ruled northern China. They had shattered the Khwarezmian Empire that dominated Central Asia. They had crushed the armies of Russia, leaving the princes of that land as vassals for generations. They had swept through Persia like a plague, leaving pyramids of skulls outside every city that resisted. And in 1258, just 2 years before Ain Jalut, they had taken Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the greatest city in the Islamic world, the intellectual capital that had preserved Greek philosophy and advanced human knowledge for 5 centuries. The Mongols had besieged it, stormed it, and destroyed it so thoroughly that even the cats and dogs were killed. Estimates of the dead range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. The last Abbasid Caliph was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The House of Wisdom, the greatest library of the medieval world, was thrown into the Tigris River. The water ran black with ink for days. The message was clear. Nothing could stop the Mongols. No army was strong enough. No city was safe enough. No civilization was important enough to be spared. After Baghdad, the Mongol forces swept into Syria. Damascus, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, submitted without a fight. Its rulers had seen what happened to cities that resisted. Aleppo fell. The Crusader states trembled. The entire Near East seemed poised to follow Central Asia and Persia into the Mongol abyss. And then they came for Egypt. The commander of this Mongol advance was Kitbuka Noyan, a general of the Naiman tribe. The Naimans were one of the Mongol Confederation subject peoples, and Kitbuka himself was an Nestorian Christian, one of many Christians who served in the religiously diverse Mongol armies. He had served Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, in the destruction of Baghdad. He had helped oversee the execution of the last Abbasid Caliph. He was experienced, ruthless, and utterly confident in the invincibility of Mongol arms. Why would he not be confident? No army had stopped the Mongols in half a century of conquest. The technique was always the same. Overwhelm with numbers, outmaneuver with superior horsemanship, break the enemy's will through calculated terror. It had worked in China against armies far larger than anything Egypt could field. It had worked in Persia against warrior cultures with centuries of military tradition. It had worked against the Russians, against the Poles, against the Hungarians, against everyone. It would work in Egypt. The slaves would learn their place, or they would die like everyone else who resisted. Or so Kitbuka believed with all his heart. But Kibuka faced a problem that his predecessors had never encountered. Hulagu Khan, his master, and the architect of Baghdad's destruction, had received alarming news from Mongolia. The great Khan Mongke was dead. A succession crisis was brewing. Hulagu needed to return eastward with the bulk of his army to participate in the political maneuvering that would determine who would rule the Mongol world. This was the curse of the Mongol Empire. Every time a great Khan died, the empire paused its conquests, while the princes fought for succession. Campaigns were abandoned, generals were recalled. The relentless expansion stopped while Mongol aristocrats negotiated, plotted, and occasionally murdered each other for the throne. Hulagu departed for Mongolia with most of his forces, leaving Kibuka in Syria with a relatively small army of perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 men, depending on which sources you trust. This was still a formidable force by any standard. It had been enough to conquer Damascus. It would be enough to conquer Egypt, or so Kibuka assumed. He sent envoys to the Mamluks in Egypt with a message that had worked on every previous target the Mongols had faced. The message was simple and brutal. Submit, pay tribute, acknowledge Mongol supremacy, and you may live. Resist, and you will be destroyed so completely that your very memory will be erased from the earth. The Mamluk response was unlike anything the Mongols had ever received. Sultan Qutuz, ruler of Egypt, received the Mongol envoys in Cairo with proper diplomatic ceremony. He listened to their demands with apparent attention. He examined the letters they carried. And then he did something that shocked the medieval world. He had the envoys executed. He cut them in half at the waist and mounted their severed heads on the Bab Zuwaila, one of Cairo's great gates, where they could be seen by everyone entering or leaving the city. This was not mere defiance. This was a declaration of total war, a message that could not be misunderstood by anyone. There would be no negotiation. There would be no submission. There would be no tribute. Egypt would fight, and either Egypt would win or Egypt would cease to exist. The Mongols understood only one language, and Qutuz had just spoken it fluently. But Qutuz knew something that the Mongols did not. He knew that his army, for all its strange origins, was perfectly designed to fight the Mongol threat. The Mamluks were not just any slave soldiers, random captives pressed into service. They were horse archers from the very same steppes that had produced the Mongol hordes. Here is the irony that makes history stranger than any fiction. The Mamluks had been purchased specifically because they came from warrior cultures similar to the Mongols themselves. For generations, Egyptian sultans had recognized a simple truth. The best soldiers in the world came from the Central Asian steppes, where boys grew up in the saddle, where archery was learned before walking was mastered, where warfare was a way of life, rather than a profession to be studied. So they bought children from these regions, Turkic peoples, Kipchaks, Circassians, and transported them to Egypt. There, the children were converted to Islam, educated in Arabic, and trained from childhood in the arts of war. The Mamluks knew Mongol tactics because they were variants of their own tactics. They knew how to ride, how to shoot from horseback, how to fight in the vast wheeling cavalry battles of the steppe. They understood the feigned retreat and the encirclement. They recognized the coordinated arrow volleys and the devastating charges. The slaves had become masters of the master's own art of war. Qutuz assembled his army and marched out of Egypt. His forces numbered perhaps 12,000 to 20,000 men, roughly equal to Kibuka's force, perhaps slightly larger. This was not the asymmetric massacre of Baghdad, where hundreds of thousands of civilians faced a victorious army. This would be a relatively even fight, professional warriors against professional warriors, steppe tactics against steppe tactics. But Qutuz had one crucial advantage beyond his soldiers' training. His general, Baibars, was a Mamluk who had risen through the ranks by sheer ability and utterly ruthless ambition. He had been purchased as a slave, probably from the Kipchak Turks of the southern Russian steppes. He had proven himself in battle again and again. He was cunning, charismatic, and completely without scruples when it came to achieving his objectives. Baibars had helped murder the previous Sultan of Egypt, Al-Muazzam Turan Shah, to put Qutuz on the throne. He would later murder Qutuz himself and seize power for his own dynasty. But in September of 1260, he was exactly what Egypt needed. A tactical genius willing to do anything, sacrifice anything, betray anyone, to achieve victory. Baybars proposed a plan that would have been familiar to any Mongol commander. He would take a small vanguard force and make contact with Kibuka's army first, making it appear that this vanguard was the entire Egyptian force. When Kibuka committed his main body to pursue what he thought was a weak enemy, Baybars would retreat, leading the Mongols into a prepared killing ground where Qutuz waited with the main Egyptian army. It was a trap. It was the feigned retreat that the Mongols had used to destroy countless enemies from China to Hungary. The Mongols were about to taste their own medicine on September 3, 1260. The plain near Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, the valley where, according to ancient tradition, the young David had slain the giant Goliath with a single stone thousands of years before. A fitting place for another giant to fall. Baybars advanced with his vanguard, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 riders. The Mongol scouts reported his approach. Kibuka received the intelligence and saw exactly what he expected to see. A small Egyptian force, clearly the advance guard of a larger army that must still be marching through the Sinai Desert. This was his opportunity. If he could destroy this vanguard before the main Egyptian army arrived, he could demoralize the enemy and secure an easy victory. If he could catch them unprepared, he could demonstrate once again that nothing could stand against Mongol arms. Kibuka ordered his forces to advance and engage. The Mongol cavalry swept toward Baybar's position, thousands of horsemen moving with the fluid coordination that came from a lifetime of practice. The dust rose in great clouds. Thunder of hooves shook the ground. Baybars held his position just long enough to be convincing. He exchanged arrow fire with the Mongol vanguard, letting his men appear to fight desperately against superior numbers. Then, as if overwhelmed, he began a fighting retreat. His horse archers traded shots with their Mongol counterparts, giving ground slowly, meter by meter, drawing the pursuers deeper and deeper into the valley. It looked like a beaten force, trying to escape. It looked like the beginning of another Mongol victory. Kibuka should have been suspicious. The feigned retreat was a Mongol specialty. They had invented it, perfected it, and used it to destroy armies from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Any experienced commander should have recognized the pattern. Any cautious general would have suspected a trap. But confidence is a dangerous thing. Kibuka had never been defeated. The Mongols had never been stopped. Why would this time be different? Why would these slave soldiers succeed where the mightiest empires of Asia had failed? He committed his forces to the pursuit. The Mongols pushed deeper into the valley of Ain Jalut, chasing Baybar's retreating cavalry. The hills rose around them, funneling them into a narrowing space. And then, from the concealed positions where they had waited since dawn, the main Mamluk army emerged. Qutuz had positioned his forces perfectly. The Mamluks appeared on the hills around the valley, cutting off the Mongol retreat. What had seemed like a pursuit suddenly became an encirclement. The hunters had become the hunted. The trap was sprung. What followed was several hours of the most intense cavalry combat of the medieval age. Mongols against Mamluks, horse archers against horse archers, steppe warfare against steppe warfare. For the first time in half a century of conquest, the Mongols faced an enemy that matched them in mobility, in archery, in the brutal arts of mounted combat. And the Mamluks were fighting for something the Mongols were not. Survival. The Mongols had conquered half the world, but they had never faced annihilation. Victory followed victory. Conquest followed conquest. Individual Mongol soldiers might die, but the empire always won. There was always another campaign, another advance, another triumph. The Mamluks knew that if they lost this battle, there would be no second chance. Egypt would fall. Islam's greatest remaining power would be destroyed. Everything they had built, their military brotherhood, their sultanate, their place in the world, would be swept away in the tide of Mongol conquest. That knowledge, that absolute certainty that they must win or die, gave them an edge that no tactical manual could provide. The battle swayed back and forth across the valley floor. Thousands of horsemen wheeled, charged, retreated, and charged again. Arrows darkened the sky. Swords rang on armor. Men fell from their horses and were trampled by the hooves of friend and enemy alike. At one critical point, the Mamluk left wing broke under a concentrated Mongol assault. The line began to crumble. Mongol horsemen pushed through the gap, threatening to roll up the entire Mamluk position. Victory seemed within Kibuka's grasp. And then Qutuz did something that Mongol Khans almost never did. He rode personally into the breach. The Sultan of Egypt threw off his helmet so that his men could see his face, could recognize him, could know that their ruler was fighting beside them, rather than watching from a safe distance. He spurred his horse forward into the melee, shouting, "Wa Islama! O my Islam!" rallying the wavering troops by his personal example. It was the turning point. The Mamluk line stabilized around their sultan's position. Men who had been ready to flee found their courage returning. The retreat stopped, the line reformed. And then, with Qutuz still fighting in the front ranks, the Mamluks began to push forward. The Mongols, who had been on the verge of victory, suddenly found themselves being driven back. Their horses were tiring, their arrows were running low, and the enemy they had expected to break was only fighting harder, rallying around their sultan, refusing to accept the defeat that seemed inevitable. Kibuka refused to retreat. Perhaps he could not believe what was happening. Perhaps his pride would not allow him to flee from slave soldiers. Perhaps he hoped that one more charge, one more push, would break the Mamluk line and restore the natural order of Mongol supremacy. He led charge after charge, hurling his remaining forces at the Mamluk center. Each time, he was thrown back with heavy losses. The Mongol army was bleeding. The Mongol army was dying. And still Kibuka refused to accept reality. Finally, disaster struck. Kibuka's horse was killed beneath him, brought down by a Mamluk arrow or lance. The general fell to the ground, surrounded by the chaos of battle. Mongol warriors rushed to their fallen commander, trying to protect him, trying to remount him, trying to save the man whose leadership held their army together. But the Mamluks saw their opportunity and closed in. The fighting around Kibuka became desperate, hand-to-hand combat in the dust and blood. And when it ended, the Mongol general was a prisoner. They brought him before Qutuz, bloody and defiant. In that moment, Kibuka showed the fierce pride that had characterized Mongol generals for 3 generations of conquest. He warned Qutuz that the Mongols would return. He promised that Hulagu Khan would avenge this defeat 1,000-fold. He cursed his captors with his last breath, proclaiming that the Mongol Empire was eternal and that Egypt would burn for its defiance. Qutuz listened to this speech with whatever emotions a man feels when he has just defeated the invincible. Then he had Kibuka beheaded. The Mongol army, seeing their general fall and be captured, finally broke. The men who had swept across half the world, who had destroyed Baghdad and conquered Damascus, who had believed themselves invincible, these men turned and fled. The Mamluks pursued, killing thousands as the rout spread across the countryside. Of the Mongol force that had marched so confidently into the valley of Ain Jalut, very few escaped to carry the news of disaster back to Hulagu Khan. The legend of Mongol invincibility died on that field, at that spring where David had once slain Goliath. But what does this victory mean? What can we learn from slaves defeating the conquerors of half the world? First, the obvious lesson. The Mamluks won because they were prepared. They had trained for this specific fight their entire lives. They knew Mongol tactics because they had been raised in similar warrior tradition. They were not intimidated by Mongol archery because they were archers themselves. They were not confused by Mongol mobility because they could match it. Second, the less obvious lesson. The Mamluks won because they had nowhere to run. Every previous enemy of the Mongols had the option of retreat, of submission, of buying time with tribute. The Mamluks had burned that bridge when they executed the Mongol envoys. They had no option except victory or death. That desperation, that absolute commitment, became a source of strength that their enemies could not match. Third, and perhaps most important, the Mamluks won because they had better leadership at the critical moment. Kibuka was a competent general, but he was overconfident, trapped by his own side's unbroken record of victory. Qutuz and Baibars were brilliant tactical minds fighting with the desperation of men who knew they must win. When the Mamluk line wavered, Qutuz rode into the breach personally. When would a Mongol Khan have risked himself in the front lines of a melee? The aftermath of Ain Jalut reshaped the medieval world. The Mongol advance into Africa was stopped forever. The force that had conquered everything from China to Syria was thrown back at the borders of Egypt. Islam's greatest remaining power survived. The civilization that stretched from Morocco to Indonesia, the trade routes, the schools, the mosques, the entire cultural sphere was preserved. Baibars, true to his nature, murdered Qutuz within 1 month of their shared victory. On the road back to Cairo, celebrating the greatest triumph in Mamluk history, Baibars arranged the assassination of the Sultan who had led them to victory. He then took the throne for himself, but whatever his crimes, Baibars proved to be one of the most capable rulers Egypt ever had. He pushed the Mongols out of Syria entirely. He began the systematic conquest of the remaining Crusader states. He established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for over 1 century. The slaves had become kings. The Mongol Empire did not collapse after Ain Jalut. It continued to exist for another century and more. Hulagu Khan established the Ilkhanate in Persia, which lasted until the 1330s. Other branches of the Mongol ruling family controlled China, Central Asia, and the Russian steppes for generations. But something had changed. The myth of invincibility was broken. Other peoples began to resist more effectively, knowing that the Mongols could be defeated. The momentum of conquest slowed and eventually stopped. Ain Jalut was not the end of the Mongol Empire. It was the end of its expansion westward. But let us return to the slaves themselves. The men who fought and died at Ain Jalut were, legally speaking, property. They had been purchased as children, transported across continents, converted to a religion not their own, and trained for a purpose not of their choosing. They had no homeland to defend. Egypt was not their country. They had no families waiting for them. Most had been separated from their families as young children, and would never see them again. They fought for a sultan who had seized power through murder, and who would himself be murdered within weeks. And yet they saved a civilization. The Mamluks did not fight for freedom in any modern sense. Freedom was not a concept that would have meant much to them. They fought because fighting was what they had been made for. They fought because their comrades were fighting. They fought because the alternative was annihilation. They fought because soldiers fight. There is something uncomfortable about that. We want our heroes to have noble motivations. We want freedom fighters and patriots and defenders of faith. We want the story to make sense in terms we can admire. The Mamluks offer us something more ambiguous. Men who had every reason to hate the system that enslaved them, fighting to preserve that system because the alternative was worse. Men who were property defending property owners. Men who were not free dying so that others might remain free of Mongol rule. Is that heroism? Is that tragedy? Is that just the grinding machinery of history, using human beings as fuel without caring about their consent? Maybe it is all of those things at once. The spring of Goliath in the hills of Galilee, the place where, thousands of years before, a shepherd boy had faced a giant in single combato. The place where, in September 1260, men who had once been bought and sold faced the most terrifying military force the world had ever known. The Mongols had built pyramids of skulls outside Baghdad, monuments to their power and the futility of resistance. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks built something different, a wall, not a wall of stone that could be breached, but a wall of horse and rider, and arrow and will. A wall that said, "This far and no further, this is where your conquest ends." Genghis Khan had united the scattered tribes of Mongolia and forged them into an instrument of conquest without parallel in human history. His grandsons had carried that conquest to the edges of the known world, and at Ain Jalut, that force met men who had been forged in an equally brutal furnace. The children of the steppes against other children of the steppes, former slaves against world conquerors, desperate men against confident men. The desperate men won. They were not free. They were not fighting for freedom. They would never be free in any sense that we would recognize. They were property when they arrived in Egypt, and legally they remained property until the day they died. Some rose to become sultans, but even sultans in the Mamluk system were former slaves who had proven themselves in war. But for one afternoon in September 1260, those slaves held the fate of civilizations in their hands, and they did not let go. 12,000 former slaves against the inheritors of Genghis Khan. One afternoon in the hills of Galilee, one spring called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The Mongols had conquered China, the oldest civilization on earth. They had destroyed Baghdad, the greatest city in the Islamic world. They had crushed Russia, shattered Persia, terrified Europe. They seemed less like an army and more like a force of nature, unstoppable as an earthquake, inevitable as the tide. And then they met the slaves, men who had been torn from their homes as children, men who had been bought and sold like livestock, men who had no country, no family, no freedom, men who, when the moment came, stood their ground and fought, until the invincible broke against them like waves against a cliff. The world's largest empire learned something that day in Galilee. It learned that even gods can bleed. It learned that even the unstoppable can be stopped. It learned that men who have nothing left to lose can defeat men who have conquered everything. The pyramids of skulls outside Baghdad still cast their shadow across history. The memory of what the Mongols did to that city, to its people, to its knowledge, remains a wound in human civilization. But Ain Jalut is part of that history too. The place where the skulls stopped piling, the place where the advance ended, the place where slaves said no more and made it stick. 12,000 men, one afternoon, one spring in the hills of Galilee, and the legacy of Genghis Khan, the empire that conquered half the world, met the force that finally stopped it. Not kings, not free men, slaves, former property who became, for one crucial day, the saviors of everything that lay beyond them. The irony would have amused Genghis Khan if he had been there to see it. The man who had forged the Mongols through brutal training and iron discipline, whose empire was built on the backs of conquered peoples. His legacy was stopped by men who had been forged in the same way. The slaves defeated the masters by becoming better versions of what their masters had created. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of Ain Jalut. You cannot build a system of power without planting the seeds of its own limits. You cannot train men for war without teaching them how to win. You cannot conquer the world without showing others how conquest is done. The Mongols built an empire by learning from everyone they conquered. The Mamluks learned the lesson too well. September 3rd, 1260, the spring of Goliath. The day that slaves broke an empire.